I have nothing to say about that moment except that, like, I just love when characters are in pain. And so...
Hey everyone, you're listening to Monster and Donut, a literary and historical deep dive into the Percy Jackson series and all of its following spin-offs. I'm Emily, someone who has experienced victimization at the hands of classics as a field study.
And I'm Phoebe, a dramaturg and story consultant. And today we're reading Battle of the Labyrinth.
Yeah.
I'm somehow simultaneously less prepared for this than I should be and over-prepared for this. Because I went back and my sister has a copy of Metamorphosis, so I reread the Minos and Daedalus portions of that. Oh. And then I reread Mary Renault's The King Must Die. Essentially like reading an analysis of the Theseus story written in the same tense and when he's about the same age as Percy is in the Percy Jackson books, ahead of reading Percy Jackson's take on Theseus. Mm-hmm. Which was very interesting. And I have to give some credit to Daphne Olive for that one. Because I read the book on her recommendation and then read it this time after she brought it up. Hi, Daphne, if you're listening. I read all of this, but then I love this book so much that I kept forgetting to take notes. And I would go like 3 chapters nonstop and then realize I had gotten too engrossed and was just sitting there like thinking my little thoughts without writing anything down. And had to backtrack. So
I'm the opposite. I took more notes on this book than the rest of the series combined. But I'm with Phoebe. I came off reading this book, and I had this thought multiple times while reading this book, where I was like, this book is just an absolute banger. Okay, so we've got a bit of a parallel with Sea of Monsters, where we start off with Percy going to school, immediately having a monster encounter, and him having to flee.
Yep.
But this time we've got Rachel there, too, who Percy met in the Titan's Curse at the Hoover Dam, where he discovered that she is a mortal who can see through the mist. She sees that there are monsters, even before Percy does, these monstrous cheerleaders that are servants of Hecate called Empusai. She freaks out and she runs away, and Percy kind of follows her, and she's having a whole thing where she's convinced Percy isn't gonna believe her because she's seeing these horrible things. And it just made me think about like all of the times in her life she's probably seen horrible things.
Oh yeah.
And nobody has believed her. Because this is very much the like Half-Blood experience that I think Percy's had also. You know, minus them actually attacking him. Like all of these horrible things he's seen or that have come after him that have like really adversely impacted him. Except for her, she's not a half-blood, so she never gets the, like, oh, you're actually a hero, congratulations, like, payoff of all the suffering. It's just suffering.
Yeah, it must have been haunting her ever since Percy ran away from her at the Hoover Dam. Like, there was someone out there who definitely saw what I saw, and I'm never gonna see him again.
Percy gets kicked out of school in a fiery inferno again. And Annabeth's like, all right, let's just go to camp. It's fine, we'll call your mom later. They never get to go on their date.
Right, so sad. I want to know what movie they were going to see.
Oh, what year was it?
This was 2008, I think.
2008. Were they going to see The Dark Knight? I bet they were going to see The Dark Knight. I'm going to Google this. On June 6th, 2009, a movie came out called When Did You Last See Your Father?
Yeah, that's a good one. If only it took place in 2009. Oh, wait. We might be doing math wrong because the first book came out in 2005. The second one came out in 2006, but then the third one takes place also in 2000, like in the same year. And so it might just be 2007.
Okay.
Oh, Surf's Up. They were seeing Surf's Up. I found the answer. It's Surf's Up.
They were absolutely going to see Surf's Up. Anyway, hard-hitting journalism.
Okay, Percy and Annabeth head to camp.
After seeing Surf's Up. No, they never got to see Surf's Up.
They never got to see Surf's Up, and this is why Annabeth is in such a mood for the rest of the book.
This entire return to camp is so funny to me also, because they get back, and Percy keeps being like, why would you hang out with Clarice? She's such a bully.
And she's acting totally normal.
Yeah, she's acting totally normal, and she's like, oh, hey, Annabeth, my friend, and Percy's like,
yeah.
What? When did this happen? As though he wasn't there. The end of the quest for the fleece. He was there.
Yeah. It's just that his relationship with Clarice didn't get any better, so he was like,
Everyone hates Clarice. I thought we knew this. She bullied me.
Yeah. You can really feel in these couple chapters how much Percy is missing by not going to camp year-round.
Yeah.
Like,
he feels really left out.
It's what Fran mentioned last time, training-wise. Everyone there is, like, expecting an attack from Kronos and so is, like, battle-ready. And Percy just comes in. But it's also, like, Clarice and Annabeth are clearly closer this time around. And Grover...
Oh, yeah.
Who's shorter than Percy now and has a girlfriend.
I know. I thought for me, like, the most stark, interesting detail that is a good reminder of how much the status quo has shifted is Percy describes a 10-foot long scar in the marble pavilion that everyone kind of, like, avoids and is looking at. And that scar is basically the real reminder of what is to this point Percy's only like real regret in this series, which is Nico. And it's also really interesting that it's described as a scar and it's still there because it's something that's permanent that can't just be like magicked away like the rest of the things at camp have to heal it. And it's also really interesting to me that Rick used the word scar because that feels to me now reminiscent also of another scar in this series, which is Luke's, which when he returned from his quest is the sort of constant reminder of a major like of a turning point in his life that like really changed his perception of camp and of things like safety.
Mm-hmm.
And then Percy goes to sleep, gets woken up in the middle of the night by a collect call iris message, which is really funny, like as a concept. He throws in a drachma and he sees a vision of Nico D'Angelo. So Percy describes him as saying he's looked like he's been living on the streets and now he's at the edge of the River Styx at the underworld. And he's basically summoned a mysterious ghost trying to get his sister back. And the ghost is telling him that it's pretty much impossible. It's never been done. But you can do an exchange. And Nico responds, I've already offered.
Yeah.
As in, he offered to take his sister's place in the underworld. 10-year-old, he's 10. He's a 10-year-old boy. And they have a really interesting conversation as well, where this mysterious ghost figure says, no, you need to offer somebody who's cheated death. And Nico says, you're talking about murder. The ghost says, I'm talking about justice. And Nico says, that's still the same thing. Showing an incredible amount of wisdom for a 10-year-old. Because I feel like he thinks about this in a way that's even more clear-headed than like most of the characters. Because most of the characters in this book have hit a point where they don't blink as much at death.
Yeah, he's got a pretty big sense of justice and judgment that I think actually sticks with him through the whole series. Like even when the lines start to get blurry, he has a sort of moral code that he works within. Because I think the danger and violence in this world became real to him like very quickly after he got introduced to it. And so it's almost more real to him than it is to a lot of characters because death and loss were one of his first experiences when he entered the mythological world. So that's the lens that he looks at the violence and its consequences there through. So we learn that Nico has been raising ghosts in an effort to speak to Bianca again, but she won't appear to him.
Which is really interesting to me because there is, in mythology, there is like one example of this that I can think about where in the Aeneid, when Aeneas goes to the underworld, this is after he has a big falling out with Dido and she burns herself on a pyre because he left her. I hate the Aeneid. He goes to the underworld and she doesn't want to talk to him because she's like, fuck you. You left. I'm spurning you even in death. I'm going to go back to my first husband. Good for her. I'm trying to figure out why Bianca won't talk to him though.
I think she thinks that if she talked to him, it would only make things worse. Like confirming that she is a physical or like a real presence that's out there that he can find.
That's true. Maybe she's trying to prevent him from coming for her.
And she just wants to make the separation a real thing. Like if she showed up, it would only strengthen his connection to her. And she's trying to let him realize that it's over.
Yeah. And we also finally get to find out what happened with Clarice last book, where she went off on her own thing and came back. And we never actually found out what she was doing. What was she doing?
She was in the Labyrinth.
Yeah, so they found an entrance to the Labyrinth in, I think, New Mexico or Arizona.
She's from Phoenix, yeah.
Because she found Chris Rodriguez, who we met in Sea of Monsters on Luke's ship, the Princess Andromeda, because he'd gone over to Luke's side. He'd come out, was babbling about son of Poseidon, skulls, the floor healing him, someone named Mary, and she basically found him and nursed him back to health. Well, not back to relative health. Mental health is also kind of a big thing in this book, I feel like. So that was her secret mission. So she discovered the labyrinth. Her friend was deeply impacted by it, and she went to figure out what was going on. Like, she had her own full heroic journey off page. So Labyrinth in mythology, and according to Percy Jackson, was created by an inventor named Daedalus, who lived during the ancient Minoan times under King Minos. In mythology, he created a labyrinth because Minos' wife was tricked by the gods into having a half-bull, half-man creature named the Minotaur. And they created a labyrinth for him to live in, and every year they would sacrifice 7 Athenian youths and maidens to the Minotaur. And in the original myth, Theseus slays the Minotaur, who's the king's son, and he pretends to be one of the youths and ends up working with the Princess Ariadne, Minos' daughter, to slay the Minotaur, navigating the labyrinth and freeing them from having to send sacrifices every year. It's my favorite myth.
Oh, it's one of my favorites too.
There's a lot of interludes in this book also. So we talked about the Nico interludes. So we get someone is mysteriously sending Percy iris messages where he gets to see what Nico's up to. But then he also starts having visions of the past, which we saw him do last book with Hercules. And now he's dreaming about Daedalus. He sees Daedalus in Minoan times getting imprisoned by the king Minos. The Minotaur has been killed up to this point by Theseus. Ariadne has escaped, and Minos is sort of blaming Daedalus. And Daedalus and his son Icarus are imprisoned in the labyrinth. And Minos says something very interesting. He says something to the effect of, "My Minotaur is dead. The labyrinth needs a monster. You'll be the monster." It started my wheels turning here, because there's a few characters in this book in particular that are demigods and also monsters. And it made me start to think about how that line gets crossed, not in the philosophical sense of like, when does a person become a monster, but specifically from a world building sense. When do they stop behaving like people and mortals, and when do they start behaving like monsters? Food for thought, but that line really made me think.
Yeah, I was thinking about it because we know that Daedalus is not in the labyrinth for the majority of this book. So I was like, so who's the monster in here?
And then, before we enter the labyrinth, though, we get the introduction to our third interlude set of this book. There's 3 different kinds of interludes that get interspaced in the chapters of Percy Dreams. There's Nico, there's Daedalus, and there's Luke, our best friend. And Kronos is saying, I'm going to lead the vanguard myself into the labyrinth to attack camp. And Luke is really trying to subtly avoid Kronos leading the army himself. And he's seeming a little desperate.
Wonder why.
He never wanted to actually go through with this part.
No, he did not want to go through with this part. We know that from the last book that he didn't want to go through with this part because of what he says to Thalia.
It felt like there was kind of a parallel between the Luke and Nico scenes a little bit, in the sense that both of them are being manipulated by older, ancient, clever forces. And neither of them like want to fully give themselves over, but also don't feel like they have a choice.
And both of the agendas are bring myself back to life.
Yeah. So finally, we enter the labyrinth. And this whole time, Annabeth has this working theory that Daedalus's workshop, because basically, we didn't explain why they're going. So it's introduced like later in the story, but like the bigger the group, the more likely you are to get lost. So an army, probably not going to make it all the way through. So they have to go find Daedalus to make sure he doesn't pledge support to the Titan army and lead them through to camp. Because if that happens, they're done so. So Annabeth's leading the quest, and she got a prophecy that she refuses to tell anybody, the last line too, and it rhymes with breath. Not a good sign.
This is a Jason situation all over again.
The what situation? Who's Jason?
I really love this depiction of the labyrinth.
Oh, yeah.
And it, specifically the way that Percy describes that when it's quiet, you can hear the labyrinth groaning like it's growing and moving and adding new tunnels. And so I started thinking about the labyrinth as a living force and wondering, why does it lead you where it leads you? Because the more I was reading, I was thinking, I don't think that it's malicious in the way that they are kind of anticipating it being, because it leads them, I mean, spoilers for the rest of the book, but it leads them to Nico and to Pan and to Mount Tam at just the right moment, and to Grover and Tyson at the end. So I started thinking that maybe it was taking them where it believed they needed to be, or like specific members of the party needed to be, or like taking you to the things that you need to see to force you to confront a truth or a weakness or something. And so that was how I interpreted this first room that they end up in.
Yeah, so they show up in a room that's Roman. A lot of Roman stuff in this book. They're introduced to the god Janus, the Roman god. For those who don't know, Janus is where we get the name of the month, January, which makes sense because he's looking backwards on the old year and forwards on the new, and it literally means door. And he basically shows up and tells Annabeth, you're gonna have to make a choice, and it may kill you. You gotta make a choice. And Annabeth's getting really flustered.
This is the half-made thought that I had while reading this, was like, why is the labyrinth starting her off here?
I had a similar question.
I do think if the labyrinth is leading them specifically to people and places that they need to see, leading Annabeth directly to facing her own indecision. First of all, evil, because it's a symptom of being an overthinker, and I understand her.
I think on like a macro scale in terms of writing, it sets up the idea of never knowing which door you need to take, and the indecision being the thing that kills you. And it really sets the vibe where it's like, no, this is a maze. You have no idea where you're going. Who knows where you'll end up? So Hera shows up, gives them some sandwiches, and basically tells them, like, hey, I'm helping you out.
For no reason.
And leads them onward to Alcatraz. Now, first of all, we have a break in the case. So in The Lightning Thief, Kronos is talking in a language that sounds like rocks scraping together, that Percy says is like Greek, but much older. But Campe is talking a language that sounds like rocks scraping together. And Tyson says that it's an old tongue that Mother Earth spoke to her children and the Titans. So it's not a language we know that's mortal. So thanks, Rick. We meet the jailer, and Tyson gets really excited because the person being jailed is one of the 100-handed ones from Greek mythology. Basically, in the origin story of Greek mythology, Gaia and Uranos, the sky and the earth, first she gives birth to the Titans, and then she gives birth to the Cyclops. And then after that, she gives birth to the 100-handed ones. And historically as well, the Cyclops and the 100-handed ones fought with the gods against the Titans. So we meet, aside from Kronos, probably the most ancient character in the series to date, Briareus. He's supposed to be like the size of a mountain, and he's just in a cell in Alcatraz. And because he's been imprisoned so long, he's dejected and really without hope. And so Tyson repeatedly says, you're so strong. Why don't you just bust out of here? Let me help you. And Briareus just refuses to try.
This was why I thought, like, I was writing down every encounter and who the labyrinth was leading to that specific place. And this one was Tyson's, obviously. I think so that he would have to face something that optimism couldn't save. That was the reasoning that I assigned to it.
Oh, I had a different thought.
Okay.
Basically, something I noticed over the course of this book is that every single one of our main characters meets their hero and has to come to terms with an aspect of them.
Yes, that was also something I was going to bring up. Although I wasn't sure what Percy's would be.
I thought his encounter with Theseus was that one. He gets to see Theseus. He doesn't get to meet Theseus, but he does get to, like, see Theseus.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking on the level of, like, oh, the labyrinth is leading each of them to their heroes. I was thinking a lot about the labyrinth this time around.
That's fair. I do like that read on it, though.
I thought maybe the hero was Antaeus. I feel like Percy has such a, like, idealized version of what it is to be the son of Poseidon, and then it was, like, breaking that. Or just bringing him to Luke, because he used to be his hero.
Brings Nico to...
Percy.
No. I don't think that's true, though.
I think that actually the way that I was thinking about Nico and Percy was almost in parallel to the way that Percy is thinking of Luke at this point, because both of them see them as this older camper who you looked up to as a kid, who you really thought of as like the picture perfect hero, and then they betrayed you and you are now left with the consequences of that. I don't know. I feel like both Luke doesn't work as the hero that Percy is looking for, and Percy doesn't work as the hero that Nico is looking for in the Labyrinth, because they've already had that illusion broken for them.
Yeah, but Nico is sort of who Percy is looking for in the Labyrinth, so this is why I want to talk about it later. I kind of want to unpack it a bit more.
Okay.
Basically, they try to defeat Campe, who is like a primordial monster. There's no way they're killing this lady, and
No.
They manage to escape her, but they're unable to convince Briareus to join them, and Tyson is really disappointed. So they get to their next stop in the Labyrinth after that.
Yeah, they find the remains of Nico's last summoning ritual and follow it up to Triple G Ranch, where we find Eurytion, Geryon, and Nico.
Basically, there's a son of Ares who's been made immortal. That's important. And they have a 2-headed dog. And they meet Geryon, who has 3 torsos and 1 head. There's a lot of people with multiple heads in this book.
I made the same note. It's not even that. It's just like doubles in general. Like Briareus with his 50 faces. And then if you think about it on another level, there's like Luke and Kronos, or like Daedalus and Quintus. Like there's a lot of the multiple sides of a person.
So basically, Geryon has been talking with Nico, who's apparently been negotiating for Daedalus's location. And then it turns out he wants to double-cross Nico and basically give him over to the Titan army. And Percy makes a bet with him about cleaning the Aegean stables. And Percy's like so confident, like, I know exactly how to do it. There's water over there. I got this. And he goes down and the Naiads already waiting for him, like, don't you fucking dare. The ecosystem, Percy. The ecosystem. And he's basically like, okay, well, I guess I'm not going to screw you over for this like Hercules did, but what do I do? And she points to the ground and she shows him that it used to be a seabed.
Right. That once upon a time, this used to be covered in water.
I'm assuming this is the part you want to talk about.
This is the part I want to talk about, because here is where I think we get the introduction of another contender for Percy's fatal flaw.
Interesting.
Which I don't have like a cute short way to explain this, but it's his vulnerability to the allure of his own power and the feeling of being powerful, combined with his complete lack of self-control or internal understanding of when he should stop. Because in this book, we see Percy a couple of times actually reach where you'd think there'd be a limit on his power, but we'll learn there really isn't one. And because Percy is often drawn in by that and doesn't have an internal flag that he should stop, it threatens to get him in trouble a lot. And here that moment is that Percy, armed with the knowledge that what is now farmland used to be an ocean, uses that to draw seawater up from the soil in geysers. And despite the tugging in his stomach, which should be an internal flag to stop, Percy summons more and more.
He even hits the point where he's like, I should stop. It's all gone.
But he doesn't, because he says, I wrote down the quote, he says, the tugging sensation became more intense, painful even, but there was something exhilarating about seeing all that salt water. I had made this. I had brought the ocean to this hillside. And he only actually stops when he hears the horses begging him to stop and sees that the water is starting to drain toward the river. And that's what finally snaps him out of it.
And it's almost too late at that point.
It's almost too
like
late.
He's only barely able to get it back.
Yeah. And this is something that we'll see a couple times from Percy. And so I want to flag it as a contender for fatal flaw, because I think he likes to feel powerful because he's had so little control in his life. And with power like this, he knows he can take control of a situation and provide his friends with something powerful enough to protect them and all that. But because he has no control over it and will almost always cross the line, it's rare that Percy feels that tug in his stomach and it doesn't end badly for him.
Yeah. And that reminds me as well of the fact that I think this book is the first time he's really like reclaiming being the main character. Like the last two, he's kind of had to
Mhm.
take a back seat. But even though this is Annabeth's quest, Percy is the main character of this book.
Yeah, this is another Labyrinth thing where I was just
Uh-huh.
really digging into the into the Labyrinth and thinking about the like what metaphorical labyrinths exist within this book, and like taking the labyrinth as a maze that leads you wherever it likes. You can interpret it as sort of fate in a physical form, so that Percy throughout this book is sort of navigating having something else leading you and having no real idea of like where you're going. Now that he's accepted that he's a child of the prophecy, he now has an official fate that he is
Yeah.
aware of.
Because this is like the direct follow up also to, again, he literally says, like, this is my prophecy. I'm choosing it. It doesn't matter
Yeah.
what fate is. Like, I choose it.
Right. And so now that he's claimed it, he now has to navigate that sort of being in the dark about where you're going, but knowing that something else is leading you somewhere.
I think you're very spot on there. Also, metaphorically, it's really good because both fate and the labyrinth are what you navigate with string.
Mhm.
But then he cleans out the staples, and Garion is basically like, well, doesn't matter. I want my money. I'm selling out Nico. And Percy's like, okay. Decides he's going to fight this guy. Stabs him. Immediately realizes that he can't kill him with just a sword. And is like, uh-oh. And he goes and grabs a bow, which is how Hercules kills him in the Hercules myth. And Percy's like, I'm not really an archer.
Yeah.
But he prays to both Apollo and Artemis, and he's like, let me take this guy out. And he shoots him through all three of his chests and kills him. He has a really interesting conversation after killing Geryon with Eurytion, Geryon's sort of like stable hand / employee, who is an immortal, who is a son of Ares, who was given immortality as a gift from his father. But he's now talking about how he regrets that choice, because now he's tied to Geryon and the ranch. It's an interesting take on, it's a trope in Greek mythology for a god to offer a mortal immortality. It happens a few times, including to Hercules. Moving on. And then they get to debrief a bit with Nico. And that's when Percy realizes that Bianca has been sending him iris messages about Nico. They summon her, at which point the ghost, who is King Minos, returns and is trying to basically disrupt the ritual. And Bianca basically tells Nico he needs to stop being angry at Percy because it's just misplaced anger, because what he's really angry at is that she joined the Hunters of Artemis. And he needs to stop trying to bring her back and move on. And then we get another Daedalus dream also, where Daedalus has a prodigy nephew named Perdix, who he just is annoyed by because he's really talented and murders him. You know, he's sort of, again, it's that thing, this idea that he's going to be surpassed in knowledge and in cleverness, and he can't take it. He can't handle it.
I think it's also the fact that he can feel his mortal body failing him.
Yeah.
And that's something that really bothers him, is that, like, you know, his eyes aren't seeing as well and his hands shake. And, like, that was part of why it was so difficult for him to put on Icarus's wings in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And now in this dream, it's only gotten worse. He can feel that, like, he is physically fading away and actually seeing someone surpass him.
In both wisdom and in youth.
Yeah.
And then Percy wakes up from that dream and says that Daedalus's annoying nephew reminds him of Nico.
Yeah.
And then we get the Sphinx scene, which I thought was really funny because it's Rick just coming really hard at No Child Left Behind. And it's just a great scene for Annabeth also, because she keeps like offhandedly answering the questions, and then she's like, this isn't a fair test. Right. What the fuck is going on? And everyone else is like, Annabeth, you're getting it right. Stop complaining.
She wants a challenge. She wants to prove that she can make it through this. Oh, right. We didn't mention, they're following a mechanical spider that was given to them by Eurytion that's going to lead them to Hephaestus's forges, because they think that Hephaestus might know where Daedalus is. Hephaestus tells them that he'll help them if they go and check out the forge that he has inside of Mount St. Helens, because he knows that someone's been using it, but every time he goes there, there's no one there. And so they start that way, but on the way, Grover feels the presence of Pan. So they all decide to split up, and Grover and Tyson go in the direction of Pan, and Percy and Annabeth head into the volcano. My main thoughts about this scene were actually about Annabeth.
Okay.
Because Annabeth was going into this quest very aware that she was going to lose someone on it, and that's why she was reluctant to bring Percy, Grover, or Tyson. So in that scene where they're splitting up, you know, Percy's sort of like, oh, well, Grover needs to do this. Let's let him do that. But Annabeth is like very against it. It's because she knows that like she is losing someone on this quest. And then by the end of this scene in the volcano, she is left alone in the labyrinth thinking that this was it. She was afraid to bring any of them into the labyrinth because of her prophecy, and she just lost all three of them like at once. And so I was more thinking, Annabeth is now alone in the labyrinth. That's crazy. How's she gonna get out? And I was like, oh yeah, and Percy's like doing something over there.
And Percy blows up a volcano.
Yeah. He like does something. I don't know. I didn't pay attention to that. Percy causes the volcano to erupt by calling water to him despite there being no water around.
He is the water, Phoebe, which is why he is resistant to fire damage.
Right? That was crazy. But I want to know if Percy is capable of using his dad's Earthshaker powers, because Hephaestus says later on that this was Percy using Earthshaker powers.
It felt also like he maybe started, I think it to me was a continuation of the Triple G rant situation where he realized he can break the rules of reality a little bit.
Yeah, it's always paired with that description of the tugging in his stomach.
Yeah, maybe coming off of that, he's realizing like, I am not just a child of a god from a human form. I'm a child of the actual sea, and because he believes that, that is why he's kind of able to do what he does and is able to kind of at first resist getting damaged by fire, because he is the sea. He's not made of flesh, and then he's able to bring the sea to him. I also want to flag, because like no one comes back to this, but Annabeth like fully, like it says kisses him, and at first I was like on the cheek, and it's like no, she just fully kisses him, and he like doesn't even think about that. Like he does, but he never even like thinks about like what does this mean? Because Percy, again, he's like, that's my friend. She kisses him because he's basically like, listen, go off. I'm about to get on my bullshit in a way like you've never seen me on my bullshit the way I'm about to be. She just kisses him. And then there's this really funny line where Percy is like, I wish I could have just stared into space for the rest of the day, being like, what just happened?
Yeah. But unfortunately, he was about to be set on fire.
But this is where he had a moment where he stopped himself from fully letting loose at the ranch. And this is the moment where he's like, all right, let's see what happens if I don't stop.
And it's so impactful that he doesn't even actually know what he did.
No, and it's also kind of implied that this would have been it, but he's kind of given a second chance via Calypso.
So Percy is thrown by the eruption into the sky, ends up landing in the water by a non-existent island where he's rescued and then sort of nursed back to health by Calypso. This is one of my favorite chapters in this book and in this whole series. I love this chapter because it is it's just as much a pause and like breath of fresh air for the reader as it is for Percy, because it's like suddenly we're no longer underground. We spend an entire chapter dedicated to sitting at peace with no enemies, no battles, just like healing from the past 11 chapters. It's sort of a unique moment that we get to have with Percy, where you get to see what happens when Percy is given peace, and like who is Percy when he's allowed to slow down. I think we see that he's actually happy to slow himself down and would actually be content with what he has on Calypso's island if it weren't for the fact that he'd be leaving his loved ones behind. But what lures him in here, he says, I could stay here forever, disappear from the earth. I could live with Calypso, with invisible servants tending to my every need. We could grow flowers in the garden and talk to songbirds and walk on the beach under perfect blue skies. No war, no prophecy, no more taking sides. That gentle, like slow lifestyle is actually something that he's very taken in by.
Yeah, I think it is interesting because when I went into reading this again, I wasn't expecting the offer to feel tempting as a reader, like in Percy's brain, but
Mm.
I think it was.
Yeah.
There's a moment where he's like seriously considering it, and it feels like earned. I think it's also because it comes on the back of their other conversation where Calypso is talking about how she became imprisoned, and she's talking about how she sided with her father in the war between the Titans and the gods, and her father is Atlas, the Titan. And he says in response to that, but the Titans are evil. And she says, are they, Percy? All the time? And then she asks him the ever important question, which is, do you support the gods because they are good or because they're your family?
Yep.
I think that question breaks Percy's brain a little bit.
I think it also just breaks like kind of the whole series a little bit.
Because it is again pointing out this thing. Why are we holding them up? Why are we supporting them? Why are we giving them our devotion when they can't even be a family with us? You shouldn't have to beg for your parent to like acknowledge you even a tiny, tiny amount the way so many of them have. But then she's also talking about the fact that her prison, it's a prison, but as far as prisons go, it's not so bad. It is kind of a paradise in a way. But she also says the gods visit from time to time and they bring word of the outside world, but they leave and I cannot. And that's the big difference. And it also makes me think about, again, agency and the kind of comparison also of like Camp Half-Blood, at least in The Lightning Thief, of yes, this is a safe space, but can you leave?
Right. And also Percy has that moment where he thinks to himself, am I too dangerous? And like that's part of why he thinks about staying, is that he knows that he has that part of him that he can't control, that is extremely powerful. It's not just because it would free him from his prophecy and from the war, but because, you know, this experience in the labyrinth has made him realize that there is something else inside him. One of the things that I thought was interesting about what Percy considers before saying no, he says no war, no prophecy, no more taking sides, as if taking sides is something that's hard for him. And I thought that was interesting. I was like, are you having some difficulty with that, Percy? So unlike Thalia, Percy turns down the opportunity to leave it all behind.
Yeah.
And leaves Calypso and returns to camp.
Just in time for his funeral.
Yes, very Tom Sawyer of him.
So they decide to head back into the Labyrinth because Tyson and Grover are still in there and they have to stop Luke.
And so they seek out Rachel because she can see through the mist, and Percy got the hint from Hephaestus that what was actually leading Theseus through the maze was a mortal princess who could see through them. Yep. And Annabeth just like immediately hates her.
She's just being weird and jealous, and like everybody knows why. Like everybody knows except Percy.
But I also think it's like Chiron points it out either before this or after this that Annabeth is very territorial about her friends and like her people. And she doesn't want other people infiltrating the group, and she wants her people to just like be her people. And it's a little bit of an insecurity that she has that goes beyond just whatever her feelings are for Percy at the moment.
I think that's true.
So Rachel leads them down back into the labyrinth, and she can clearly see the way to Daedalus's workshop, which happens to be straight through the arena.
It's also, the arena is presented multiple times in the book as an inevitable like place you have to go through. You can't go through without eventually encountering it, which I thought was really interesting.
How I interpreted it was that the maze has rerouted itself so that you have to walk through here just this time. Like, it's not like you always have to walk through here to get to Daedalus's workshop, but this time around, you specifically have to walk through here.
Oh,
and so, to me, this was what the labyrinth offered Percy and also offered Luke as what they needed to see. Percy has to go in there and understand that being Poseidon's son doesn't automatically make you good, and like that sort of alternate version of himself. And what Luke has to confront, he is being forced to give and give for the entertainment of someone that ancient who is clearly not going to let them go. And I wondered if it was the labyrinth almost warning him that he is in a very dangerous situation right now, and that this is kind of his last chance to get out. He's going to give and give, and he's never actually going to get what he made the deal for, which in the scene it's like, you'll grant us passage out if we keep providing you with entertainment, but then it's just over and over, more entertainment, and it's pretty clearly implied that he has no plans of letting them out. And so maybe the labyrinth is putting him in that situation to kind of make him realize like where he is metaphorically at the moment.
I actually think, okay, I like looking at this whole encounter with that lens though. I think also like the entertainment aspect really sticks out to me, because both the ancient Greeks and Romans are really well known for sports and spectacle. And it's also one of the ways we in our world now actually still perpetuate their old traditions. You know, like the Olympics ran every 4 years in ancient Greece with only 2 breaks in the cycle for 1,200 years straight. It only really ended like during the collapse of the Roman Empire. But, you know, when they began excavating the ancient classical world in the 1800s, that was a huge point of revival. And so they brought it back, but they also imposed a lot of their own ideals and rules on it. The biggest one being the amateur rule, because for a while you could not compete in the Olympics if you were paid or unprofessional as an athlete, because for them, you know, work is dirty. Figures in, you know, the ancient world were philosophers. They just languished about. They were just like them, when like the reality is they were just as well paid and, you know, just as full of like sponsorships and professional as, you know, we think of professional athletes today. It's really an example of Rick's definition of the West at that time, really finding that old flame again and reviving it of the ancient West. So it's interesting here in this scene too that this is all like a pageant almost, of a mashup of a lot of different really iconic ancient sports traditions, both from ancient Greece and Rome, but all kind of as we've seen them in our pop culture. Like, for example, a gladiatorial fight. Like, you know, in our pop culture, we think of it as they were always fought to the death. When they weren't. Like, can you imagine if every single boxing match ever had to end with one of the 2 boxers dying today? Like, it's just not economically sound. Likewise, you know, the Dracena that Percy initially fights is dressed, you know, Grick says classic gladiator style, but like, she's dressed as a retiaris, which is only one of the many kinds of gladiators, but it's one you see all the time because it's really iconic with the net and trident, and it looks a lot more different to the others, and it's more distinct. It's also, for example, what Finnick Odair is in the Hunger Games, fun fact. And, you know, with Antaeus as well, it's a similar thing where we take this ancient Greek sport of pankration, which was in the original Olympics, but it's probably one of the last ones added. And yeah, I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment, but it is really interesting to me. And then they're like, okay, let's send you not a monster, but our fave, Ethan Nakamura.
Ethan is a son of Nemesis, goddess of revenge, who was found inside the labyrinth. I don't know if they ever explain why he was in the labyrinth in the first place, but he's found wandering the labyrinth by the Titan army. And they, I guess, give him their pitch, and he decides that he wants to join up. And so he becomes who they are trying to make their last soul to raise Kronos. But first, before they do that, he's doing this to prove himself.
It's like a full circle moment when he's fighting Ethan and he uses the disarming technique Luke shows him in the first book on Ethan and insists on sparing him, even though Ethan keeps saying like, no, it's fine, just kill me, they'll kill us both otherwise. It's a proxy fight. All of this is a proxy fight between Percy and Luke.
I love that moment because we know that Luke was watching his sword fighting pretty closely because he comments on it. And then Percy goes and makes that move.
I know. I remember when I was reading these books when I was a kid, this is the first time I remember really being like, oh my God. Because I feel like up until this point, every death, every encounter with Luke or other half-bloods on Luke's side have always been either non-lethal or very clearly like good guys versus bad guys, life-threatening situation. This was the first time in this series, I feel like as a kid, I was like, yeah, this guy's on the side of the Titans, but he just joined up. Like, he seems like a pretty chill dude. He's not evil. He's just here because he has nowhere else to go. And Percy having to face him in the arena. I remember like that it being a half-blood specifically who already also had clearly been like hurt in some way because of his eye patch. It was really striking to me as a kid. And then he challenges Antaeus to a fight. So Antaeus says, "Oh, you're gonna fight me? I've been fighting since the first Pankration." And then he says what a Pankration apparently is in the Rick Riordan verse, because this is not what a Pankration was in the Greek Olympics. Was no rules, fighting to the death, no holds bars. It used to be an Olympic sport, is the quote. That's not what it is. Pankration was kind of like the equivalent of Greek MMA fighting, where there weren't no rules, and you didn't fight to the death. That's not to say people didn't die during these matches, but it had the same two rules as boxing and wrestling, which were no eye gouging, no going for the genitals, because as you might remember, they were doing this naked. And then they had to add a third rule after a certain event transpired, which was no disemboweling. They fought barehanded. I want you to remember that when I say no disemboweling had to be added. But anyway, there were rules, and it wasn't to the death. You would fight until someone got knocked out or yielded. But there was pretty much no holds barred, so that is correct. And that was the Olympic sport. Anyway, but what's also interesting is that Antaeus was like known for wrestling in the Hercules version of the story. He's able to use strength to beat Antaeus. He basically figures out that he can hold him above the earth just by holding him up, and basically chokes him out while keeping his feet off the ground. And that's how Hercules beats Antaeus. Percy cannot do that. Like, in a way, he sort of beats Antaeus the same way Hercules does, because that's his weakness. But this is, like, I feel like one of the only times he really doesn't do what's in the myth. He does something completely unique to him, and he is forced to use wisdom. And he is forced to have to outsmart and outmanipulate this ancient creature. And the way he does it is really good, because you really see him using his wits and specifically his skill in manipulation.
I almost wondered if he'd gotten like a momentary blessing from Athena. Because the way he's weaving all of that and crawling all over there, I was like, that is
true. He does say that, like, it must have just been how good I am at tangling things. The thing that really got me that I thought was really cool was specifically the Riptide thing. Because we've seen him use Riptide in interesting ways, but he hasn't really ever used it as, like, part of a fighting... Like, I feel like we haven't really seen Percy strategize a lot on page.
I think I disagree with that, because I think that Percy always, his first instinct is to try and think his way past any obstacles or enemies that he encounters. He's usually trying to think at least, like, 3 steps ahead while fighting. A lot of his fighting technique comes down to strategy.
Maybe it's not that this is, like, one of the few times we get to see it, but rather this is the time it's, like, the most pronounced to me, because he is so unable to do any damage with physical skill. He has 2 things at his disposal. He knows that Antaeus doesn't know that Riptide appears in his pocket, and he has a moment where he loses the sword, and he's like, all I have to work with is the fact that he thinks I'm going to need to go for my sword, but he doesn't know I don't have to. And with those 2 pieces of information, he is able to think his way out of the solution and execute it to a really cool degree. Like, I cannot wait to get to see this. This is probably the scene I am most looking forward to seeing on the TV show. This whole scene. I love this whole scene.
I'm curious about, because this is actually something that I was thinking about. The way that Percy describes Luke in this scene, he's acting like perfectly normal. Like, he's like sneering down at him and like wearing that cocky smile. It was a moment where we realize how unreliable Percy might be as a narrator, because after this scene, Annabeth says, something was wrong with Luke. Did you notice the way he was acting? There was something wrong with him. He looked nervous. And you kind of realize just how much Percy's bias is skewing the story. And it's like this little break in what we've been thinking is the reality of the book, because if you took Percy's word, you would think that Luke was acting like his old self in this scene.
Yeah.
You do see it in moments, and it's when he's like interacting with Annabeth in this scene. But Annabeth is like, no, something was very wrong with him in that. Didn't you notice it? And it was specifically her saying, did you notice? And I was like, He didn't notice, actually.
He didn't.
I read that chapter and he did not notice.
He didn't. And switching gears a little bit, reading this, like, after reading the Diary of Luke, made me crazy. We've had a lot of conversations about Luke and his want for glory. And we've talked a lot about all of the ways you get glory, all of how you get, and how that is, in a way, the path to, like, immortality and agency. And it's really interesting to me, the struggle that Luke is going through from that lens specifically, because I feel like the giving yourself over in body and, like, full, like, giving up the use of, like, yourself, basically, to Kronos. It's the ultimate way to erase that. Like, you're never going to get glory from that. He is going to lose himself completely. He's never going to see the world he's making. He's never going to get to be the hero as himself. And the fact that he's not even able to, like, say goodbye to her, but, like, he wants to. He wants to get his chance to talk to her and to just be able to at least have her know what happened to him. And for her to have that legacy of him. And then he doesn't even get to do that.
I did wonder if his deal with Kronos, if he thinks, like, once Kronos takes over my body, I'm done, like, I'm gone. Mm-hmm. Or if he thinks that Kronos is letting him go at the end of all of this. I think there's a line. Okay, he says, soon you will rule the world of gods and mortals. So I wonder if he thinks he and Kronos will forever be in this form and that he will no longer be himself. Or if he thinks once this is done, Kronos will be able to take on a different form and I will be there to rule the world of gods and mortals. But at the same time, I do think he probably still thinks that even if he is gone, they will tell that story because he was essential to bringing Kronos to power.
But he won't get to be the one to set the narrative.
Yes.
Maybe what it is he knows that no matter what happens, he's about to lose Annabeth. Like, there's no way he will be able to explain it to her after. Because he doesn't know what Kronos is going to do in his body. In his brain, if he can just explain it to her, then he'll at least have potentially not destroyed that relationship.
It's unfortunate that there's a whole scene between now and I open a coffin. But, so they escape the arena. Rachel continues to lead them through the labyrinth.
He has another final Kronos dream. And this one, he's like, Kronos is, like, almost physical. And then Kronos says something absolutely wild to Percy, which is, you have assured my rise. What? We need to do an entire breakdown of, like, Kronos's... I feel like we've already talked about this, and we're definitely going to do, like, a wrap-up episode on the series when we're done with everything. I can finally, like, talk about everything. And one of the items on the agenda is, what was Kronos's plan? Let's track this. What's going on? Because I'm just like, what do you mean? Yeah. Like, it's like he's saying as though, like, now, after all of this, you finally assured my rise.
Yeah. It was as if, like, that meeting with Luke had been, like, the final nail in the coffin, or nail out of the coffin. And I was like, but they barely talk.
Well, we'll tease it out.
No, you know what it was? Duh, it was sparing Ethan. Because Ethan is the last soul that he needs to rise.
Interesting. Okay, that's less fun, though. So we're going to dig deeper.
Yeah, let's think of something else.
Like, you're right, but, like, let's pretend you're wrong.
If Luke had gotten the chance to talk to Annabeth, it would have changed his mind. And because Percy won in the battle, Luke didn't get to talk to Annabeth, and Luke didn't change his mind. There's the more fun version.
Okay. I feel like we can dig even more.
Oh, okay. Let me...
And they finally find Daedalus's workshop. And this is when Annabeth gets to meet her hero.
She loses it. She gets so mad in this scene.
So we get the reveal that Quintus is Daedalus.
I mean, this is kind of where Daedalus's struggle with his own failing body, you learn where that kind of landed him. What I thought was interesting was when he shows them the wiring inside of his arm. There are three reactions. Rachel's is, that's amazing. Percy's is, that's weird. And Annabeth's is, that's not natural. I think the one that really stuck out to me was Annabeth. You know, like, she's constantly in awe of the inventions that Daedalus comes up with, but this one is where it's like, you've gone too far.
Yeah. And, I mean, cheating death is obviously, like, a pretty big thing in most mythologies. That's like the one major taboo. I don't know. It's more of a philosophical question. But like, why is death the line? And then to that end, like, it feels like what Kronos is able to offer is a way to cheat death because he's like the god of time. I think what's really interesting also is the confrontation between Daedalus and Annabeth and everything. But he basically says Kronos' offer was to give Daedalus a prized position in the underworld and to let him actually cheat death. This is something that even Hades can't really give him. And for Daedalus, it's that guarantee. Because I feel like he still feels dogged by death. And, like, I think the other thing that really seals it is when Annabeth says, oh, no, what convinces him in this scene? No, it's in the scene. What convinces him, like, not to go through with it in the end? Maybe this is it. Maybe, like, again, we've seen both with Icarus and Perdix. Both of them, Daedalus is both of their heroes, in addition to, like, being their parent. And I think, again, we have Annabeth, who is Daedalus is her hero. And him having to confront somebody who should idolize him, who is also blessed by Athena, who would understand. And them looking at him and saying, you've gone too far. And I think, oh my God, you know what it is? Because that's also the moment that the Labyrinth brings, finally, Nico to Daedalus. So Nico, who's been seeking Daedalus the whole time for his quest, this is the final moment. This is the moment the Labyrinth actually gives it to him. Not because this is what Nico needs, but it's because that's what Daedalus needs. Because there's that moment in that line where Percy mentions how much Perdix reminds him of Nico. Nico, who is kind of a symbol of youth kind of cut off too short. And Nico comes back, and Daedalus has to reconfront his own weakest moment. And that's what turns the tides, because he's finally able to make a different decision.
I think this is also part of the another one of the metaphorical labyrinths that we have going on here. A lot of the characters going through the labyrinth, this is a sort of theme that we see going through, especially the end of this book. Characters trying to navigate grief, and the labyrinth as, you know, a force that can drive you mad, that's like built to keep you in there, as like a sort of representation of trying to navigate grief. And that a lot of that is true for Daedalus, but it's also true for Grover after Pan. It'll be true for Annabeth after Luke. It's true for Nico. There are a lot of characters wandering the labyrinth just trying to find their way out of grief. And I think that that's a big one for Daedalus. I guess that's kind of skipping ahead, but...
Well, I think, no, what you're saying makes total sense, because I think if we're thinking about the Odyssey as a story of abandonment, then I think, like, the same thing being grief for the story of the Labyrinth is extremely true. Because, as I mentioned when I was describing the original myth, like, it's about sacrifice victims, ultimately. It's about the way the story ends. You know, Theseus is able to destroy the Minotaur, leaves Ariadne behind on his way home, and then he comes home, and the last kind of tragic element of the story is that his father had told him when he gets back, he needs to fly white sails so that he'll know that Theseus is returning safe. Because usually the ships would fly black sails when they returned from dropping off the sacrificial victims, you know, as a sign of mourning. And Theseus, in all of the confusion, totally forgot to change the sails. And so Aegeus sees the black sails, and he throws himself into the sea at Cape Sunion, which is a temple to Poseidon. I might have taken Phoebe there when she came to visit me in Greece. It's fine.
You guys should check it out. The water's pretty cold, but...
Yeah, she went swimming. She was like, I'm going swimming. And I was like, Phoebe, it's so cold. What are you doing? And she's like, I don't care.
I'm at the Temple of Poseidon and I'm not gonna swim?
But, you know, and Theseus comes home in triumph only to have to be, again, walloped in grief. Likewise, Daedalus, his entire story that we've seen as well is one of grief. And, like, that is what built the Labyrinth. Yeah, I really like that interpretation. And I kind of want to go back and talk more about that, because this is what we should have been talking about the whole time.
I'm sorry, I should have brought it up earlier.
I want to do kind of a wrap up as well, where we explore each character and what their journey is through the Labyrinth and how it relates to grief. Maybe that's the way we should do it. So let's come back to that in a sec.
So the best chapter is next.
Oh my god. So they're able to defeat Minos, which is great. And good for Nico. I love personal growth. They're going back through the labyrinth to Warren Camp, but they stop right outside Mount Tam. Percy's like, I gotta go.
So Percy uses Annabeth's invisibility cap and sneaks into the Titan base, where he finds that golden casket that is said to contain Kronos' new body that we've been hearing about throughout the whole book.
Daedalus made an automaton, like it can be a thing.
Yeah, we've been hearing throughout the book that it's nearly fully formed. So Percy decides that he needs to open the coffin and kill whatever's inside before it can wake up.
And it's just like this build up where it's really building up to this, like, what's in this coffin? It's been a mystery for 3 books now. It's like this larger than life, horrible, monstrous thing beyond comprehension. Like, what could be in it? It's pieces of a Titan. Like, what does it even look like? And Percy opens it, and it's just Luke. When I first read this, I remember, like, freaking out. I feel like this, to me, is, like, the ultimate, like, archetypical reveal. Like, whenever I think of a good reveal, it's this.
Rereading it, you can, like, absolutely see all of the clues and,
There's so many. It's so good. It's good.
All over the place. But he gets you so good with the, like, oh, they must be building a body. Like, here's all the hints that they're building a body.
It's so good. Like, oh my God. Rick, you really did something here.
He did. Here is where I want to bring it back to the Theseus myth and the way this book kind of skirts it.
Yeah.
Because it's frustrating reading these books, because the further we get into them, the further we get from seeing what's going on in Luke's mind. Mm-hmm. This book especially, we don't get to see much Luke at all. And so this is how I've sort of hacked into what Luke's thinking right now. I think there's a clear parallel between Percy and Theseus. Like, from the beginning, like, they're both sons of Poseidon, mm-hmm. raised by their mothers, who don't know their fathers and are trying to prove themselves to them, and they're known for outwitting their enemies. Like, the Procrustes story is a Theseus story, mm-hmm. and it's also a crucial part of our introduction to Percy, like we talked about in our first episode. But Percy really isn't thinking about Theseus going into the labyrinth. He's thinking about Daedalus. Mm-hmm. And so I started to think, if anyone's going into the labyrinth focusing on Theseus, it's probably Luke, both because of the way that he's fixated on getting Ariadne's thread, but also the way this venture into the labyrinth is part of his sacrifice to stop the treatment of innocent children at the hands of the king or the gods. You know, in The King Must Die, what Theseus does here is spark a rebellion. And so Luke's journey into the labyrinth was all with that end goal in mind, finding the way to camp and then giving himself over to Kronos. So he went through this anticipating sacrifice in the face of injustice, like Theseus volunteering to sacrifice himself. And it made me think that if this book were to be from Luke's perspective, he would be thinking on the Theseus side of things, and all of those Daedalus interludes would have been Theseus interludes. Yeah.
I think you're right, because part of me kind of in my head as you were talking about this was making these connections and thinking to myself, well, who's the Ariadne in this situation? And it feels almost like that Ariadne, in a way, is kind of Annabeth to me.
Yeah. She's
the person that he's supposed to care deeply, that he does care deeply about, he's supposed to care deeply about, that he just abandons her because all she was a means to an end. Luke is abandoning Annabeth in that way, in a way that completely breaks her heart after making it through everywhere.
So Percy, we get, just touching on this very briefly, we get Percy giving into that instinct to run away that we've talked about a couple times when he sees Luke stand up, no longer as Luke, but now as Kronos. So Percy takes off, but Kronos has time powers, so slows him down. But Rachel snaps him out of it by hitting him with the blue plastic hairbrush. Iconic moment. And Percy makes it back into the labyrinth with Nico, Annabeth, and Rachel. And they're starting back on their way when they find Grover's cap in the dirt. And they realize that they are close to wherever Grover and Tyson disappeared to. And they're, like, basically right in front of where Pan has been all this time inside the labyrinth.
Yeah. And Pan, the god, is kind of fading in and out. And he sort of has a parting message for all of them. And I was getting, like, emotional during this scene. And I don't get emotional in books easily. But, like, everything we've been talking about has really, like, made me really be thinking about all of this. And, like, thematically, I think there's a reason that this scene comes after Percy opens the coffin. Because opening the coffin is an interesting scene, but it's not, like, the end. This is not, like, the point. This is not the final piece of the labyrinth, you know? This is the final scene in the labyrinth. Because I didn't phrase it this way in my notes, but I think what Phoebe was saying about it being grief is what this book is about. And specifically, this part is grieving what in a way is already gone. Basically, the god Pan, who is the god of the wild, has been actively fading for years, for thousands of years at this point.
Pan is kind of a special case with the gods because he is a god who has seen the effects of Western civilization on his realm, and that's what's killing him.
Mm-hmm. Interestingly, this is where we get into a little bit of what I like to call Emily's classical Bronze Age conspiracy theories. One of the things that has always fascinated me is etymology of gods' names, because I am always really curious when specific gods crop up. And Pan is really interesting because there's a few different theories as to where he comes from. Okay, so for those who don't know about Athens, the Acropolis is the name of this giant, basically rock that's sort of it's the center of Athens. It's where the Parthenon, the temple to Athena, is on top of. But that rock has been settled and around for a really long time. It's interestingly because of the geology of the rock itself. Rainwater kind of comes through it and comes out of it in specific springs. So it's where a lot of really ancient peoples and even the Stone Age would come and settle because there's fresh water coming through that's basically run through a filtration system that kind of also fuels a lot of the rivers that go through the city. What's also really interesting is that there are these caves that are carved on the far side of the Acropolis that we think date back all the way to that Stone Age. And there's an interesting theory that they were used as partially as a worship of Pan, this god of the wild that could be a god that's really indigenous to specifically the indigenous peoples who lived in Greece. Because as I think I mentioned before, the people that we know of as the ancient Greeks are not indigenous to Greece. They moved in much later. And they would have been, in Greece at least, that kind of original displacement and colonization of the West into these lands. Greece was the first place colonized by the West. And Pan kind of being the witness to that from the beginning. And again, he'd been dying ever since that moment if he's a god indigenous to the true actual indigenous peoples of Greece.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing he says to Grover that I thought was a bit of a whammy for the whole book was he says, "You believe in me the most, so you must be the first to let me go." And that made me think about Luke in the coffin and Annabeth. That made me think about Annabeth and Daedalus. That made me think about all of these heroes we've seen over the course of this book, and also what this means in terms of grief. Because, if you're holding on to grief, in a way, you kind of do have to be the first to let that go as well in order to move on.
So we see Pan die, and a part of his spirit enters all of their mouths.
And he kind of calls everyone out by name except Nico.
Except Nico. I was like, hello? What?
Yeah, poor Nico. Anyway.
Say something to him. But they make it through the labyrinth back to Manhattan with the help of Rachel. They drop Rachel off in Times Square, and they take Pegasi back to camp where everyone is preparing for Kronos' attack.
This is another big shift I felt because it was a big this time it's for real mood, I think, in the description of how they're preparing. There's detailed fortifications. It's how do we actually defend this place?
I think the moment where I felt like it was real was when Percy's describing all of those fortifications and everything, and then Chiron looks at it and says that it's not enough. Yeah. And then Percy looks at it and is like, oh yeah, he's right. He's been describing it it's oh, we're all getting ready, we're prepared, and then it's oh, actually, we're in over our heads.
Yeah.
So Kronos' army erupts from the labyrinth, and the battle begins.
They're making a last stand. Things look dire, and then Daedalus actually returns with Briareus.
Right, who they kind of turn the tides, but what actually turns the tide is Grover using the power of Pan, releasing his ghostly wail. I don't know if you watched Danny Phantom, but that is what Grover does. And it's such a good moment for Grover. I love that moment. I was just talking to my brother. My brother read these books but doesn't remember them very well.
You can relate.
But I was like, oh, I'm reading the Battle of the Labyrinth. And he was like, that's the one where Grover does that thing. And I was like, it is when Grover does that thing.
Wow, John Johnny, I didn't remember that part. I did not remember how they won this battle.
It's such a good moment for him, though. just combining like all of what you would think of as his weaknesses as like his panic, and it's probably also combined with the grief from having just lost Pan, and all of it just like bursting out of him at once, and it's amazing.
And
good for Grover.
That does successfully turn the tide. They all retreat into the labyrinth, and then Daedalus says, "It's linked to my life force, and it's time I stop cheating death." And Nico puts him to rest, and his final sacrifice is what assures the camp will be safe from this threat. And they're finally able to like survey the damage. The two campers that are named that pass on are Lee Fletcher, Apollo cabin head, I think.
Yep.
And Castor, one of Dionysus's twin sons in Greek mythology. Castor is the mortal one, and Pollux is the immortal one. So the one who survives is named after the immortal one. And we actually also get to see when Dionysus returns right after the battle that he is really truly grieving. And this, I remember reading this for the first time, was also very striking to me. Like, this is one of the things I actually most remember about Dionysus, is how he genuinely grieves his son.
Yeah, like no other god does.
Yeah. This
was also one of the moments I remembered going into this, of like just the image of Dionysus in that black suit.
Yeah.
His entire demeanor has like completely done a 180 with the death of his son.
Yeah.
And I love that moment of him and Percy just walking back through the forest, and you just have to kind of sit there with Mr. D's grief coming at you.
Yeah.
And it's kind of the last of the characters going through grief, which it's not the one you would have expected.
No. To that end, I kind of want to go back, and I want to think about each character's journey again, and just like really, I want to explore it because I feel like it is really interesting.
How each of these characters are experiencing grief in this book.
How each of them have to use the labyrinth to navigate their grief.
I feel like Nico is probably the clearest version of this, with him going into the labyrinth, grieving, and coming out kind of at peace with it, coming out of that grief. And even like when he exits the labyrinth in the middle of the story, he has that moment with Bianca's ghost and kind of gets to take another step in his journey through his grief over her, but then has to go back into it to complete it, which is handling the part that has to do with Percy.
Well, I just want to dig into also, like, what does he actually end up doing in the labyrinth as well? Like, for him, it's a lot of negotiating and bargaining. I think he's trying to, like, reason with it in a way. What was also interesting is he goes to the underworld to talk to her, and he's not able to talk to her until he gets to the labyrinth. The labyrinth is what finally leads him to be able to talk to Bianca.
Yeah.
Which is what he really needs to do the most.
I think another character who you can see fairly clearly is Daedalus, trying to navigate his grief over his son and his nephew. And so I sort of thought of him re-entering the labyrinth finally, like in the last quarter of the book, as him finally confronting it, because that is the deal that he's making with Kronos, is that he's going to have to confront that. And he has to go back into the labyrinth in order to make that deal with Kronos, or at least to fulfill that deal with Kronos. I don't know if we know exactly when he made it, but going back into the labyrinth means that he is sort of accepting that this is something that he has to address again finally, because he's just kind of been sitting in it for a while.
Yeah. We can talk about Tyson maybe, because that's simple. I feel like we should build up to like the bigger ones.
I mean, sure, like Tyson and Grover I think are fairly easy ones. Grover being someone who has been avoiding grieving over Pan and reluctantly going into the labyrinth.
Yeah, because I think that is like the main thing with Pan and the satyrs, is they're refusing to let him go. They're refusing to grieve.
Yeah.
And so instead of him navigating the labyrinth carrying grief, he's navigating the labyrinth
to find it.
Yeah, to find it.
And in Tyson's case,
he also wasn't carrying grief going in.
Yeah.
But I think you made a good point earlier where he is like the most optimistic character. And I think it's important that his is the first one we kind of encounter where, you know, like even having all of the theoretical tools, it's still really hard to get out of it.
I don't know if we can count Rachel. Rachel knows how to navigate it perfectly. She has no issues with
She
grief.
has no issues with it. And I think that comes through in her relationship with her dad. It feels like it's...
Yes, I think Rachel is navigating her grief over losing her relationship with her family in a way, but it's something that she's been dealing with for so long that she can just kind of make her way through it without much issue. But there are obstacles in it that she does have to navigate and isn't prepared to navigate. And then Annabeth is an easy one because it's Luke. That's
and I think
it's Annabeth grieving Luke and trying to navigate how to handle a loss that hasn't yet happened. But also it's beyond Luke. It's navigating grief that hasn't yet happened because she has her prophecy warning her that you're gonna lose someone on this journey, and so she just spends the entire book mourning, and she doesn't even know who it's for yet.
Yeah.
The last two we've got, I think Luke is navigating grief for his own life.
Yeah.
Because he knows that it's over, basically. And, you know, we know that he goes, like, in and out of the labyrinth constantly. And keeps trying to send other people into it.
Yeah.
Because he does not want to go in there.
Nope.
But eventually he has to go in there. Okay, the character I'm struggling with is Percy.
Yeah.
Because the book where I think he's experiencing the same thing that Luke is experiencing now is the next one. It's more like navigating grief for the old perspective on life that he had. Like grieving the life that he had before the tone shift. That's what it is.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think it's grieving like his childhood.
Trying to navigate this new version of the world that is so much darker than it was in book 2.
Yeah, you know what it is? I do think he goes in at least grieving specifically Nico, because Nico's the person he couldn't find. And he's not grieving Nico because he knows Nico's okay, but he's grieving Nico's childhood. And I think Nico as a child is sort of a stand-in for pre-everything Percy. It's the childhood he never really had, I think. Also, I want to talk about coming back to that line of like the labyrinth always needs a monster. Because in a very real and literal sense in this world building, it's really interesting that the labyrinth is tied specifically to Daedalus's life force, because that is how Monster Donut works, tied to the Hydras.
Yep.
Like the world building supports the fact that Daedalus has become a literal monster, not just a metaphorical one. He's an automaton as well. He doesn't die or bleed the same way, and he actually has to be put to rest by Nico. Like, I wonder what would have happened if they'd tried to kill him, like the traditional way. I wonder if he would have actually gone far enough to go into Tartarus and return someday. Likewise, like, Antaeus is also a monster and a demigod. And then that also made me wonder, per your question of like, who's the monster in the labyrinth when Daedalus leaves, if there has to be a monster in the labyrinth. At first I thought Antaeus, but I think that's too easy. Actually, now that I'm coming back to it and thinking about what we were talking about with like Luke being Theseus in this situation, it made me realize that I think, much like grief operates differently, like the monster is kind of different for everybody. And I think specifically here, in both Percy and Luke's case, I think the monster are each other. I think Percy is like Luke's Minotaur and Luke is Percy's.
That's what I was thinking.
But they fight each other by proxy in that arena for entertainment, which is sort of like what, and again, in the original myth, like you'd feed the Minotaur, and in some versions it's also for entertainment. And Antaeus kind of ruling over it as the sort of like de facto Minos in this myth when Minos is gone. I forgot about this. I just remembered why I had this thought in the first place. And it's because Kronos says to Percy, Luke fears you. Yeah. Like Kronos seems to think Luke's fear of Percy is substantial. And Percy's floored because he's like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm afraid of Luke. Like, I think both of them are the thing they fear. And what I haven't put together is why Luke is afraid of Percy.
I think that Luke is afraid of Percy. One is that I wonder if Luke knows the prophecy. If he does, then that's an easy reason for him to fear Percy. Another is that Luke basically created his own enemy, both by training him to sword fight and by betraying him. The only reason that Percy is after him and is actually able to fight him is because Luke kind of allowed him to. He fears his own creation, basically. And like I said when we were talking about Sea of Monsters, that Percy is pretty unpredictable. to Luke. And like, I think maybe at this point, maybe he's starting to realize that following the Titan's curse.
Yeah.
Maybe he's kind of put that together, that this is an enemy that he can't anticipate, who basically understands him and knows what move he's going to make next constantly, and can appear and watch him in his dreams.
That's true. Luke knows he's been watching him in his dreams this whole book, because Kelly keeps being like, Kelly the Impusa is there, and she's like a servant of Hecate, so she knows when Percy's watching, and she keeps being like, oh, we've got an eavesdropper, hold on, let me take care of that.
Yeah, and like, this has happened consistently. I think the only book it doesn't happen too often in is Sea of Monsters.
You know what else I think it might be? Is I think Luke knows, like, if things were different, Percy would be like Kronos' chosen, basically. And I think he fears being cast aside for Percy. I think maybe that's it as well. Also, that threat of like Luke's life is not in his own control because of Percy, because Percy keeps foiling all of his plans to do all of the things he actually wants to do. And Percy just keeps taking every dream of his away one by one, leaving him only with the worst consequences of his decisions as opposed to like the benefits.
Yeah. Okay.
So we're winding down, and I just wanted to flag this because I think it's a really great scene. They wind down, Percy has this chat with Dionysus after the battle, and then Hera comes up and basically says she's been helping them the whole time. She basically shows up, says, I helped you, sacrifice please.
Yeah. And the stuff that she says that she did, like, it's basically the entire book was set up by Hera.
Yeah. It's a really good reminder of all of the things Luke's fighting, all of the reasons why Luke is doing what he's doing.
Yeah. It's kind of the only, like, because our encounter with Hephaestus, he's generally pretty good to them.
Yeah.
Pan, perfectly nice god. And then at the end, we get, like, a very friendly interaction with Poseidon. And so this is kind of the only one that feels like part of that kind of criticism of the gods.
Mm-hmm.
It, like, I was kind of put off by how nice everyone was in this book.
Yeah. Right after this, Poseidon shows up at their apartment.
Yeah, and he like genuinely reaches out for like the first time in his life. I think the only other time that he's reached out on his own was the brace yourself thing.
Yeah, but like that was
the extremely helpful
yeah.
Brace yourself. And he comes in like, oh yeah, it's just me, your dad. And like, it was just such a strange scene to me.
It's very strange. He comes and he's talking to Percy, and Percy's like, hey, there's this guy that was like sacrificing in your name, like killing all these people and all these monsters for you. And he said he was your favorite son. And Poseidon says, no, the way our sons and daughters act in our names say more about them than about us. Which is like, it's such a cop-out. And then he says, and you're my favorite son. Like, Tyson's right there.
Oh, yeah, Tyson's there.
Like, if you have more than one child, you can't tell one of them, oh, you're my fave. Like, what? That's not good parenting, Poseidon. That's just not good. And Tyson's right there. This scene it's written in a way, and the narrative tells you, like, this is heartwarming. It's great. Poseidon's really reaching out. Percy's impressing him. And it's like, no, he's not doing, like, this isn't genuine connection. This isn't good parenting. Like, Percy's finally done something, I guess, worthy or whatever of, like, a very toxic parent. And it's like the narrative's rewarding him for that.
I could see this scene being, you know, it's Percy's birthday, and so Poseidon, knowing the prophecy, knows that he has 1 year to make sure Percy's on his side, and so shows up to be like, oh, it's me, your loving father. Please fight for me when the time comes. And like giving him a present that will help him eventually fight for him.
Mm-hmm. What's the present again?
Not something he actually wants.
Oh, right. It's the...
If he gave him like a DS, then it'd be like, oh, wow, thanks, Dad. Like, oh, wait, didn't the Wii come out like that year? Yeah, he should have gotten him a Wii.
Should have gotten him a Wii.
Okay, so one last thing before we end this. This book does have a bead, which is just a red or orange bead with a maze painted on it.
Mm-hmm.
So we can do better than that.
Oh, yeah. I actually know exactly what's on it. The chains hanging from the ceiling of the arena.
Okay.
That's the scene I think about when I think about this book, and it's always been the scene I think about when I think about this book. And coming back to reading this, yeah, that's the scene.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's like I saved the golden coffin for this one instead of the second book, but I almost don't want to use it Like, my brain is telling me to pick a Moonlace.
Why?
I've just always loved that chapter so much.
Yeah,
it's like I don't have a real reason. I like the way that it rounds out the rebuilding the wild thing at the very end. And I like the way that it is a piece of that kind of paradise that Percy can keep right outside his window, like keep by his bedside. I don't know. I've always, like, I have a painting of Percy on my Instagram that's just him, like, surrounded by a moonlace in the water. I've always loved it, so I might just say moonlace.
I like it. That's a good one. Thank you all for listening to Monster Donut. Next time, we are not reading The Last Olympian.
Nope. We are going to be reading The Bronze Dragon and The Stolen Chariot from the Demigod Diaries. The Bronze Dragon actually takes place during Battle of the Labyrinth, so we're going to be reading that next. Until then, if you would like to get in touch or see some of the art that I made during the recording of this episode, you can check us out at PJOpod on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And I am also posting the time lapses of those drawings on my YouTube channel, which is Phojoko, Phojoco. I posted my first TikToks this week, so you should all look at them.
Please do.
One of them has like 40-something thousand views and like 300 likes. Like, no one likes it.
But who keeps watching it?
It's just me watching it over and over again.
Oh my god.
Okay. Thank you all for listening. Bye, everyone.
Bye.